Thank you all for joining us this morning. As the screen says, this webinar is being recorded, so please stay on mute and get your cameras off just to help with bandwidth and to avoid distractions. And this is the 11th of our broker webinars for this year. All previous recordings of webinars can be found on our website under the Broker Training Hub. My name's Chris Withers and I'm the Broker Distribution Director for Ecclesiastical. For any of you that do go back and watch any of those recordings of the webinar, I think you might see that I wear this shirt quite a lot for webinars, but it's my favourite, that's why. But we're joined today by Alex of Eunomia. All of our webinars have been presented by specialists on topics that brokers have told us are important to them. We did a session with Alex and Eunomia earlier on in the year on net zero and the importance of net zero and what it means for us in the insurance industry. And we deliberately timed this second webinar to coincide with COP27, which is very much in the news at the moment. And the focus of the COP27 has been about not so much about setting new targets, but about implementing the ones that were set. And that fits really nicely with this, because the webinar that Alex did previously was about what we've got to all do. And today is about how we can actually get there, with the practical steps that we need to take to get to net zero. I mentioned the fact that all recordings of our webinars are on our website under the Broker Training Hub. We also have a series of podcasts, and Alex features in one of those too. So Covered in 15 is a 15-minute podcast that is available anywhere where you get your podcasts, but again is also available on the Ecclesiastical website for those of you that want to go and look for it. I'm going to hand over to Alex. Your slides have come off of the screen, Alex, just so as you know. And I will join you later on, or I will return to the camera for our Q&A at the end, because we've got plenty of time to take your questions for anything that isn't covered within the webinar. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Alex.
Thanks very much, Chris. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Chris, for the introduction. As Chris alluded to, I'm Alex Forrest from Eunomia. In terms of my background, I'm a decarbonisation service area lead for private sector clients at Eunomia, which means essentially I'm working with organisations such as yourselves to help organisations take steps towards decarbonisation. I've been working in the industry for about 20 years. I don't exclusively work with private sector clients. I work across Europe and globally with different NGOs and governments to support decarbonisation. So some of the sectors that I work in include energy, retail, healthcare and manufacturing. So yeah, delighted to be here today. And just to give you a sense of what we'll cover. So this is what I'm hoping we'll cover today. So the session's objectives and outcomes. This is very much building on the previous webinar that we delivered and that Chris mentioned, which was very much a carbon literacy piece, getting brokers to understand why action on climate is particularly important. So this session builds on that. It's very much framed as a practical session, really, to help you all understand what are the key emission sources associated with your organisational carbon footprint, which we'll go into in more detail. But also how you can take steps towards measuring and reporting carbon reduction within your organisation, and what are some of the practical steps that you can take towards tackling carbon. And we're illustrating that with some case study examples of good practice around, what are the steps and who is already taking action on climate within their organisations. So that's what we're sort of setting out to achieve this morning. Before we get into that, I guess by way of a bit of a recap, it's always useful to take a step back, and Chris has already alluded to this really. Why is it important to take action? As Chris mentions, we've timed this session to deliver this webinar. It's been delivered around the same week as COP27 in Egypt, which builds on COP26, which you would have heard lots about in Glasgow last year. So this webinar is being delivered a time when global leaders and business leaders around the world are convening in Egypt to double down on climate change targets and commitments. This illustration just really sort of sets that home. Really, the last 8 years have been the hottest on records in the UK and globally. And that's not going to go away. If you look around the world, if you read the papers, I'm sure you do, ecological crisis, displacement of populations, food security, all these issues relate back to climate change. And if we don't take action now, all of these issues will become more severe and will impact on our daily lives. At an insurance level, I mean, I've got a couple of quotes here. These quotes come from an article on brokers and ESG, which was posted in Insurance Post magazine, an article on greening the broker industry in 2022. I'm not going to read out both of these quotes in detail, but just to sort of pick up on a few sort of key sentences. Really, on the left, we have a quote from Kennedy's Law, Fleur Rochester, who was quoted in the article, and she says that in a market where reputation is everything, if brokers continue to miss the mark, insurers have declared that they will end relationships. So that's a pretty stark warning for those within the industry, that if we continue along the path of business as usual, this will lead to real sort of severe business consequences, really. So ESG and climate strategy is no longer a nice to have. It's becoming mandatory in the eyes of clients and investors and consumers. On the right, we have a quote from Nick Hobbs, the Chief Distribution and Regions Officer at Alliance Commercial. Just to pick out the sentence here, he says that those businesses that are not thinking about doing their utmost to achieve net zero will eventually be left behind. So again, the warnings are there for all of us, really. But in the context of the insurance and broker sector, it's critical that carbon strategy and carbon reduction is very much at the top of the agenda. And just to sort of take this back to Ecclesiastical's climate change survey, which was commissioned earlier in the year, again, not to sort of dwell on all of these numbers, but just to pick out a couple. A third of brokers believe that their clients are increasingly interested in climate issues, and this very much chimes with broader research, actually, that was released by Ipsos Murray this week, that states that 8 out of 10 Britons are now concerned about climate change, 84%. So it's very much at the top of the agenda for clients, consumers, and concerted action across the industry. All industries is really required, and it's particularly important to think about it in the context of insurance, not least because of the impacts that climate change will have on businesses and industry, and we need to really think about how we respond to that. But in the context of today, one of the things that came out of this survey was that 2/3 of brokers felt that the main barrier to setting net zero targets is that they don't necessarily have the resources in order to respond. So this is really why we've designed this session here this morning, is to help you all just think about some of the practical issues around climate and what that, and how to apply that in the context of your organisation, in the context of carbon reduction. So before we get into that, it's always useful just to sort of recap on what we mean by net zero. Net zero is a definition, really, which is really to help us understand where we need to get to. So the definition that we have here is net zero is achieved when human greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere are balanced by removals over a specified period. So the science tells us that we need to get to net zero by 2050, and there's a significant emphasis on removal. We can't plant our way out of this. So if you think about how we tackle carbon, there's often too much emphasis on offsetting our emissions. So offsetting business travel, offsetting the emissions associated with the use of high carbon intensive sources of energy like gas and coal. We simply can't plant our way out of this. We can't offset our way out of this. The science tells us that we can only offset between 8 and 10% of our emissions globally. So that really hits home on what we need to do around reduction. We need to reduce our emissions specifically. And carbon footprinting is a mechanism by which we can understand what our emissions look like. It provides us a means of organisations understanding what their baseline position is. So what is the starting point? How much carbon equates to your organisation, your organisational footprint? So it's a mechanism by which we can help to understand our emissions and identify hotspots or areas that we should prioritise, areas where we have influence to reduce our carbon impact. And these are typically classified within the carbon footprint. If you look at greenhouse gas, the international recognised standard for carbon footprinting, which is framed around the greenhouse gas protocol, this tends to classify carbon emissions within 3 scopes, and we'll look at that in more detail here. So as I say, if we follow the science, what we need to do is think about and understand our carbon emissions within our organisations within these 3 scopes: scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1, that typically relates to all emissions associated with refrigeration and gas combustion, so gas and refrigeration energy sources. Scope 2, that typically relates to the purchase energy for all our use in our organisations. And then scope 3, which is often the scope that organisations tend to forget or put less emphasis on. This includes everything else. So this is all the emissions, all the carbon emissions associated with things such as employee commuting and business travel, goods associated with the disposal of our waste, for example, from office premises, carbon emissions associated with the purchase of catering equipment or catering services, ICT consumables, goods and services associated with running our businesses. So all of these need to be thought about and quantified when we think about carbon footprinting, in order to follow the science and in order to develop a carbon footprint in line with industry standards. So how do we measure our carbon footprints? There's, in relation to all of these 3 scopes, there's a means and a mechanism by which we can start to think about how we gather the data associated with these activities. There isn't a lot of time here today to go into this in detail. And I would say that in terms of scope 3 emissions, this doesn't reflect the full scope of scope 3 emissions. There are many other sources of emissions, but I've focused here today on, I guess, some of the more common categories that you'll be more familiar with, but also those where organisations have the ability to influence and reduce emissions linked to these activities. So when we think about data sources, these are the types of data that you'll be needing to think about in order to start quantifying your carbon footprint. So, for example, if we want to quantify carbon emissions associated with gas, electricity, it's typically utility bills that we're needing to source and collate. If we're wanting to quantify carbon emissions associated with goods and services, it's having a good handle on what your expenditure data is on associated goods and services. For business travel, it's thinking about what data sources that you have internally, such as expenses or booking system reports or staff commuting data. In some instances, you might want to, for example, do a staff commuting survey. So on the right-hand side, these are I guess the example metrics that you would typically use in order to quantify your carbon footprint. The good news is a lot of thoughts has been undertaken in around sort of developing tools for carbon footprinting. So some of the tools on the market, which I'll run on to in later slides, gives you some examples of some of the tools that are out there. But this is, before we get into that, this is a typical example of what an organisational carbon footprint looks like. So as I say, carbon footprinting is classified within 3 scopes. And what this shows you is actually when we think about where key emission sources arise linked to our carbon footprint, scope 3 actually includes by far the most significant emissions associated with our organisational footprint. And you'll see here purchased goods and services represents a significant source of emissions. So it's I guess the key message is it's really important to think about all emission sources associated with our organisation, and really try to follow standards such as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol when we start to think about our carbon footprint. And towards the end of this presentation, I've listed further data sources and further information and further guidance which you can take away and have a read over in order to get a better understanding around all of this. As I mentioned, there are a number of carbon footprinting tools and platforms on the market. I've selected 3 of the perhaps what I'd consider to be the best versions of carbon footprinting tools. There are literally hundreds out in the market. So these 3 examples here, the top left is the Rio platform, which provides you a means to calculate your carbon footprint using your own organisational data as a basis. On the right, this is the normative platform, and at the bottom, this is a platform called Spherix. So these typically all operate on a license or a subscription basis. So a monthly or an annual fee in order to access and use the platform. What it will require, as I say, is you as organisations to input your organisational data, and as I mentioned on the previous slides, utility data, spend associated with goods and services, travel data associated with commuting and business travel. All of these activities will need to be reflected within your carbon footprint, and it requires you to have a think about data sources in order to populate your baseline. As I say, I'm conscious that's a lot of information. This is a bit of an introduction to carbon footprinting. As I say, there's a fair amount of guidance and links towards the back of the presentation, which we'll share after today. So that's a bit of an introduction to how to approach carbon footprinting. At this stage, we want to focus on where to take action. So what are some of the practical areas and interventions that organisations can take in order to reduce their organisational carbon footprint? So I'm focusing here today on, I guess, areas, as I said at the start, we want to sort of try and focus on areas where organisations have more influence to take action. So what are some of the quick wins, sort of short, medium and longer term areas for intervention in order to help you to reduce your carbon footprint? So what we're focusing here this morning around are actions relating to buildings, goods and services, commuting and business travel, energy and waste, and we'll run through these individually. So I'll start by focusing on scope 1 and 2 emissions, which, as I said at the start of the webinar, this is very much linked to energy consumption within your organisations. I think it's important, before we get into that, to recognise that there are efforts being undertaken at a national level within the UK to decarbonise the electricity grid, but this isn't expected to be achieved until 2035. So for organisations that are looking to follow the science, that tells us that we need to reduce our carbon emissions, our own organisational carbon footprint emissions, by about 50% by 2030. So whilst there are efforts being undertaken at a national level, if we want to achieve our own organisational targets, that really is going to require concerted efforts at an individual organisational level. So, for example, some organisations may be looking to explore renewable electricity tariffs, but a lot of this is going to require introduction of energy efficiency measures and also behaviour change measures. So changing the way in which we run our businesses and the way in which our staff operate, but also thinking about how we can be more efficient in terms of how we use energy within our organisations. And just to put that into context, within the City of London, a third of the city's carbon footprint is actually associated with heating and cooling commercial and industrial buildings. So that really that really sort of sets the context really around what we need to do. We need to really sort of focus on how we operate our businesses, how we heat them, how we cool them, and think about the carbon associated with that. So this slide on the right-hand side, this is taken from the UK Government Building Energy Efficiency Survey in 2016, which shows us where the key emissions are associated with offices in the UK. And as you can see on the right-hand side, a significant proportion of energy and carbon is associated with heating, with lighting, cooling, and the operation of ICT equipment. One of the first things that I will sort of start with in terms of carbon reduction opportunity quick wins is around switching to a green energy tariff. And I'm conscious that many of you won't necessarily own your offices, and you may be dealing with landlords. But for those of you where that presents an option, really switching to a green energy tariff is that absolute quick win. It means that some or potentially all of your electricity is matched with the purchase of renewable energy. One thing to note is that not all green energy tariffs are always straightforward. Some operators will buy green energy certificates from renewable energy providers, and what that means is you may be buying a sort of green energy tariff which is not strictly green or not 100% green. So the key thing is to read the small print. But as I say, one of the where it is possible, switching to a green energy tariff is a quick win to reduce carbon emissions by sourcing renewable energy for your office premises. As I said, one of the key emission sources associated with operating offices is related to heating, cooling, and lighting. So typically 50% of total energy consumption in offices relates to heating, cooling, and lighting, and that inevitably has a significant carbon impact. So again, it's thinking about measures where we're able to influence carbon reduction for heating, cooling, and lighting. And again, I'm conscious that where you're sort of leasing offices, the level of influence here might be challenging, but where it is possible, switching to LED lighting, for example, that can reduce energy consumption by 80%, and therefore there's a significant carbon saving associated with that. Where you're able to switch out, if you're doing retrofit, for example, in some of your offices, switching to air source heat pumps for space heating can contribute 20% less CO2 than boilers, and ensuring really that your building management system controls are operating correctly for the season. It's a relatively straightforward intervention, but think about, are you using heating and cooling when you don't need to? Are your heating systems actually aligned to your working hours? We're all working in the office less, working from home more. As a sort of real life example, the office that I work in, there's certain days when I'll walk in the office and the air conditioning is up and running, and it's a case of having conversations with your building landlords to make sure that the heating systems are appropriate for your working hours. And then finally, making sure that you're dressed appropriately for the seasons. It's a relatively sort of simple thing to say, but yeah, wearing appropriate clothing to make sure that you don't need to use air conditioning or have the heating on. Obviously, that's something that is relatively straightforward to do. But yeah, just making sure that simple things like that are implemented within the office. Office equipment. This is an interesting one. As you can see here, 25% of total energy consumption in offices is linked to ICT equipment. So what we really advocate here is ensuring that there's checklists that are operating at different times of the day to help understand what your consumption patterns are, and really think about where consumption can be reduced linked to consumption patterns within the office. Ensuring that equipment is switched off when it's not being used, ensuring that the power down modes are set as standard. This really requires a level of engagement with staff, ensuring that all staff are aware of a switch off policy. And wherever possible, purchase really highly energy efficient electrical equipment, and also really sort of try to measure any improvement actions to ensure that you're really making a difference in terms of reducing energy relating to office equipment. As I mentioned, a lot of the interventions here might not necessarily be the easiest thing to implement. It's all about influence and where you are renting office space from landlords. Some of these interventions might be quite challenging to implement. So what we're doing as an organisation is we think very carefully about, as Eunomia, we've signed up to science-based targets. And with that comes challenges in terms of reducing our emissions to deliver net zero by 2050. So what we're doing as an organisation is thinking quite carefully about the sustainability credentials of our existing landlords. So, for example, exploring whether your existing landlord has their own carbon reduction strategy, because if you're serious about reducing emissions, halving emissions by 2030, delivering net zero by 2050, you can't really do that. If you're renting office space, you can't really deliver on that if your landlord hasn't implemented a significant carbon reduction strategy. So what I'd encourage you to do is engage with your office landlords to understand where they are up to with their decarbonisation commitments and strategies, and think about who you want to lease office space from in future years, where you're reletting office space, and ideally select office providers based on net zero commitments. So there's a couple of examples here, as I say, on the right hand side, Bruntwood in Greater Manchester, where Eunomia rents office space from. They have a net zero commitment and are following the science to achieve net zero by 2050. On the left, Grosvenor have recently announced, Grosvenor being one of the largest commercial office space providers in the UK. They have recently signed up to science-based targets in order to deliver net zero by 2050. So this is, again, something to think about in terms of sort of medium to longer term commitments, but certainly in the short term, I'd recommend engaging with your landlords to understand where they're up to with their net zero strategy. So that's scope 1 and 2. For the remainder of the session, the plan is to run through some areas of good practice in relation to tackling scope 3 emissions. So as I said at the start of the session, a significant proportion of an organisation's carbon emissions are tied into the goods and services that they buy, that they procure. So a bit of a pop quiz at this stage. So the question is, and you can think about this in your heads, we're not running a live poll as such. The question is, what percentage of organisational carbon emissions are typically scope 3 emissions? So 20%, 40%, 60%, or 80%. And for those of you that remembered the pie chart, the graph at the start of the session, that was a bit of a clue. So the percentage of organisational carbon emissions, which are typically scope 3, the answer is 80%. So as I said at the start of the presentation, a significant proportion of an organisation's carbon footprint is associated with scope 3, which does include the goods and services that an organisation procures. As you can see here, supply chain emissions are extremely significant. So typically, when we compare that against scope 1 and 2 emissions, so scope 1 and 2 being emissions associated with largely energy that an organisation consumes, supply chain emissions are typically 5 times greater than scope 1 and 2. And this varies by sector, but in the context of the service sector, you can see on the chart here, it's more than 5 times greater than scope 1 and 2 emissions. So this is really important to get across, is that if we don't tackle emissions associated with the goods and services that we buy, we're not making real progress on net zero. And if you think about the goods and services that we buy, many of which are from overseas, everything that we buy, whether that's furniture for an office, ICT equipment, these are typically goods that have to be manufactured from raw materials. So raw materials extraction is carbon intensive. Those raw materials are then manufactured, which is manufacturing is a highly carbon intensive process, and then those goods and services need to be shipped to us to use and consume. So this is why supply chain emissions are very significant, because they're carbon intensive processes to manufacture those goods. So it's really important that we don't forget supply chain emissions and we tackle those. And really, what we're talking about here is thinking about what we buy, where we buy, and how we consume goods and services. What we tend to advocate is organisations developing a sustainable procurement policy, really to guide decision making at the point in which goods and services are procured. So the starting point is often to reduce what we buy. So really thinking about whether we need to buy in the first instance, whether there's opportunities to redeploy equipment that we already have. So, for example, office furniture. Do we really need to buy new furniture? Have we got furniture, for example, in other offices that have been underutilised? Similarly with ICT, do we really know, have we really got a very strong ICT asset management system? Do we know how many laptops we have in other offices? Do we really need to buy another 50 laptops, or is what we have actually, fit for purpose? So really rethinking about the need to buy. If we do need to buy, thinking about whether we can buy remanufactured goods or refurbished goods. I'll come on to remanufactured goods as an example in the slides that follow. Can we buy sustainable products? When we talk about sustainable products, are the items that we're buying designed for recycling at end of life, or are they items that are poorly designed that prevent recycling at end of life? Can we buy goods that have recycled content within them? All of which reduces the need for virgin materials, which allows recycling systems to operate. So we often, as I say, in thinking about tackling carbon emissions associated with the goods and services that we buy, having a sustainable procurement policy which drives decision making linked to procurement activity is a really useful way of helping category managers and purchasing teams play their own role in reducing carbon emissions. So another sort of question to think about, another sort of pop quiz question. I mentioned furniture. Buying remanufactured furniture is a really quick win opportunity for reducing carbon emissions associated with office furniture purchase, because we're typically remanufactured furniture uses less materials. It's often repurposing or remanufacturing office furniture to reduce carbon emissions. So we've got two chairs here. Which is the remanufactured office furniture chair, left or right? I'll put you out your misery. They're both remanufactured. So you typically, you can't tell the difference. Buying remanufactured, to say it's a very good way of reducing carbon emissions, because you're typically using 50% less virgin materials. And the good news is low carbon remanufactured office furniture is typically a lot cheaper than the standard price of virgin office furniture. So typically, as you can see here, significant savings associated with buying remanufactured. And just to illustrate that, really, in the form of a case study. So this is as an example from the Green Building Council, which recently refurbished their offices. Rather than buying brand new furniture, they source remanufactured furniture. They took their existing furniture, so offices and desks, and asked the office provider to remanufacture and reupholster their desk tables and chairs rather than buying new. And in response to that, the total bill for the refit was less than half the price, and it achieved a significant carbon saving. So as you can see here at the bottom, the carbon footprint was 22% below the standard office fit out benchmark. So it delivered cost savings and it delivered carbon savings. So this is a real quick win example of how organisations, when they approach an office refurbishment, to think about carbon reduction in the context of office furniture. So another question for you. How much of the Earth's resources are mined and consumed to manufacture one laptop? Is it half a tonne of materials, 1 tonne, or 1.2 tonnes of materials? How much of the Earth's resources are mined and consumed to manufacture just one laptop? And the answer is 1.2 tonnes of material. So if you think about what 1.2 tonnes of material looks like in the context of one laptop, that's huge. And that actually equates to 1/3 of a tonne of CO2 per laptop. So significant use of raw materials in order to manufacture the day-to-day laptops that we use within our offices. And as you can see here, 342 million PCs were shipped around the world in 2021. So that just puts into context the carbon footprint globally that ICT equipment is responsible for. And again, if you think about the context of office premises, thinking about ICT consumption is an area that we really need to tackle. And again, the good news here is that there's already significant progress that has been made within the industry to try and reduce carbon associated with ICT. So again, a key option here is to buy remanufactured. If you do need to buy further ICT equipment for offices, I'd encourage you to really think about buying remanufactured ICT. So the key thing to get across here is that this isn't refurbished or second-hand ICT equipment. Remanufactured ICT goes through all the same rigorous standards and processes that the new ICT equipment does. And one of the key buyers of remanufactured ICT equipment in the UK is the Ministry of Defence, surprisingly. So if you think about the level of risk that building submarines takes, and Ministry of Defence are buying literally thousands of these items a year from certified suppliers of ICT remanufacturing equipment. A couple of quotes here from the Ministry of Defence. Buying remanufactured ICT reduces manufacturing need, a process that emits 50 times the annual CO2 emissions of operating existing equipment. And as I say, the good news here is that you can buy remanufactured laptops at about 1/3 of the price as new, and it delivers 97% of the performance of new models. So opportunities to reduce carbon, opportunities to reduce the price of ICT equipment. And just to highlight this in another case example, so another large organisation in the UK, the Royal Mint, is also purchasing remanufactured laptops via Circular Computing. Circular Computing are a certified supplier of remanufactured ICT equipment. They're on government frameworks. They're a government supplier of remanufactured ICT equipment. As you can see here, they offer extended warranties for up to 3 years, and they carry the BSI kite mark for remanufactured products. So hopefully gives reassurance that these are absolutely not second-hand items. They come with similar warranties and certification as new ICT equipment. So in terms of wider consideration around carbon footprint in the context of organisations, I'm aware that maybe less catering events are being held in response to COVID. We're getting together, and the expectation is that there's less corporate events. But where we think about carbon emissions associated with catering, this won't be a surprise to any of you, as in that red meat carries a significant carbon footprint compared to other types of meat or other types of menu options. And this slide here just illustrates that in terms of numbers. So red meat, 6,200 kilograms of CO2 proportion compared to vegetarian options, which is 1,000 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. So again, if we're thinking about catering events, if we're serious about tackling carbon emissions associated with our overall footprint, it's really important to think about menu choices and catering options to reduce carbon. The other thing I wanted to touch on is packaging. Again, this is often areas where we can reduce carbon associated with our organisations. There's a lot of emphasis on reducing plastics, and a lot of that is driven by ecological impacts associated with packaging. It's often forgotten about that whilst we need to tackle the ecological issues associated with packaging has significant carbon impacts as well. The slide on the left hand side just sort of hits that home really, but what it does show is that glass packaging has a much higher carbon impact than plastic does. So if we're switching from plastics to glass and we're disposing of that glass, that also carries significant carbon impacts. The ideal scenario is that we prioritize reuse of packaging wherever possible. So if we're switching to glass, make sure that the analogy here is milk deliveries, you know, whether that's domestic or office based. Yes, we can tackle plastics by switching to glass consumables, but it's really important that glass or that packaging gets reused in order to maximize the number of cycles in the system in order to tackle both the ecological crisis associated with plastics, but also the carbon impacts associated with packaging as well. I wanted to move on now to business travel and staff commuting, because clearly this is an impact that relates to all of you, no doubt, I'm sure. What we tend to advocate from a sustainable travel system perspective is thinking about travel in a hierarchy. So the slide on the left hand side illustrates what we're trying to achieve in terms of moving towards a more sustainable transport hierarchy. The first step in the process is very much about tackling demand, so reducing unnecessary travel and trips, whether that's on a business travel or on a commuter basis. We're then seeking to optimize travel through sustainable modal shifts, so increasing active travel through cycling and walking, for example, and then really trying to optimize sustainable travel. So using sustainable travel options as far possible, so public transports wherever possible. And then for those organisations that do operate a fleet, it's really thinking about electrification and EV. But as I say, that the emphasis really is around sort of the top end of the hierarchy, reducing travel demand and increasing active travel where possible, and using sustainable transport options. None of which I'm sure will be a surprise to you. But what we tend to advocate is formalising this in an organisational sustainable travel policy. One example I have here from Cardiff Metropolitan University, who have done exactly that. So this is something which is highly publicised within the organisation, particularly in the context of business travel, and is formalised to enable people to think about this and implement this in their sort of daily sort of organisational operations. What the Cardiff Metropolitan University have done beyond that is to try and look at incentivisation of this sustainable travel policy. So, for example, they offer mileage for cycling, which is pretty innovative, and then there's sort of further behaviour change measures to enable this to be incentivised within the organisation. So, standard things like ensuring, cycle facilities are maintained. That the staff are able to access showers, One other thing which is quite interesting is the Better Points app, which is gaining traction particularly within the public sector. But it's an app that allows businesses to reward employees for implementing sustainable travel options. So for trips where staff are able to walk or cycle or use public transport, they are able to accrue points, which can then be used for purchase of wellbeing vouchers and activities outside of work. So again, I think a lot of what we talked about in relation to travel are things that are relatively well understood, but in order to implement that in an organisational setting, the key here is formalising a policy, but also thinking about how you actually incentivise staff in order to make that switch to more sustainable travel options. I also wanted to touch on waste because, again, waste is a key source of carbon emissions within our organisation. We all consume the goods and services that we use, whether that's ICT equipment, office paper, catering, consumables. All of these items will at some point end up as waste within our organisations. The way in which waste is managed within an organisation through waste contractors, fundamentally, it's either going to be recycled. There'll be a residual element. Some of the waste, a portion of the waste that we generate within our organisations will end up in landfill, which has a carbon impact. Some of that might be sensor energy from waste, which also has a carbon impact. So wherever possible, we should be thinking about how we prevent waste within our organisation. And we advocate formalising this in the form of a waste management policy with a significant emphasis on prevention. So this is, again, taken from Eunomia's own waste prevention checklist. As I say, examples of how we can all contribute to reducing waste within our organisation. So, for example, ICT and furniture. Can we repair or upgrade before disposing wherever it is economical and safe to do so? Can any surplus food that arises through catering, can that be offered to other staff prior to being disposed? Is it possible to move towards a no disposable items policy, so removing paper towels, cups, and disposable cutlery? So again, real practical examples of how organisations can think about preventing waste and ultimately reduce their carbon impact. A lot of what we talked about today are practical areas where organisations can take action. At the start of the webinar, it was very much framed around how you baseline your current position, and what we've talked about since then, as I say, is around practical interventions to reduce carbon emissions, whether that's through changes in purchasing policy, switching to lower carbon intensive goods and services, or thinking about the energy in which we consume and how we go about the day-to-day operation of our businesses through staff travel and commuting. All of these interventions, if implemented successfully, will result in carbon reduction. And therefore, it's really important for us to measure and monitor what the transition towards carbon reduction looks like. This is an illustration taken from one of our carbon footprinting projects that we delivered, just to highlight where carbon reduction can be achieved through concerted action. So again, just to sort of hit home that it's really important to report and measure, and the tools, the carbon footprinting tool examples that I mentioned at the start of the session, provide a means to do so. So before we move on to Q&A, just to sort of sum up with some practical actions and sort of key messages, really. So number one, I would recommend convening a net zero working group. So ensure that you've got good representation from across the organisation within that working group. So for example, FM, finance, procurement, fleet, fundamentally ensuring that we have senior leadership represented on that net zero working group. Really ensure that the carbon literacy is being provided. The session, the early webinar session that we delivered is a good example of content that you can circulate amongst colleagues, but there's lots of examples out there, carbon literacy providers, in order to ensure that carbon is really understood within the business. Develop a carbon baseline. A lot of what we've covered here today was around approaches to carbon baselining and understanding your carbon footprint. I'd recommend that you review the different carbon reporting frameworks to help you define what net zero means to you in order to ensure that you follow the science, to allow you to think about the targets that you want to set within your organisation. Beyond baselining, develop a net zero strategy and a plan. As I say, a lot of the actions that we've talked about today reflect some of the areas where you can take action. There'll be many more, but think about that and frame it in the context of a strategy. And then, as I've mentioned, ensure that you monitor progress and report on that, communicate it to your stakeholders, whether that's internal or external. Reporting to internal stakeholders can really galvanise action and get commitment and buy-in. And reporting externally can help you to ensure that you're communicating to investors or wider stakeholders what your commitments look like. So that leads us on to the Q&A session. At this point, I'll hand over to Chris.
Thank you, Alex. Trying to get my camera back on. I think that's a bandwidth issue there. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Chris. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you. I will try and get my camera on. There we go. Thank you very much for that, Alex. Very thought-provoking as always. And I think whilst people gather their thoughts for questions, please do pop them in the chat. I think the thing that comes through to me is, I suppose, there's a cultural shift almost that's needed. You talked about sharing the material that you've produced previously to help with the carbon literacy in the office of the people that are listening today, and I suppose they might be surprised by how engaged and aware some of those people already are, and how they're how many ideas they might already have as to how the office can help sort of improve its movement towards net zero. So engage widely and signpost, because you can sort of imagine how some of those conversations would go about using remanufactured equipment, recycling materials and things like that. It's not so long ago that if an organisation did that, it would feel like they were cutting corners or making cost savings for the sake of it. And actually now it's a big shift that is a better thing to do for the benefit of the environment, as well as perhaps being more economical too. So it does need to be that sort of cultural shift alongside those changes.
Yeah.
Sorry, Alex.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think what we're talking about is a lot of this is about behaviour change and sort of framing it in the context of why we're doing it. I think if the why is there and people understand the direction of travel, and just simply convening the different stakeholders across the organisation, one individual can't do this on their own. It requires all stakeholders within the organisation to come together, and just by convening the different parties within an organisation, you'll be surprised, what you can achieve. Canvassing the views of procurement and office managers, that's really where you can start to get buy-in, but also spark ideas.
Well, there haven't been any questions come through on the chat, so I will just one more sort of call out to people. I think there's a lot of information to take in. I would point everybody back to the previous webinar and the podcast that Alex has done as a chance to sort of share this wider amongst your teams. If there's no more questions, then we can wrap it up there, and I'll just say, Alex, thank you very much on behalf of Ecclesiastical and all the brokers that have joined us today and will watch the recording. Thank you very much for the content, for the engagement and the interest, and Thank you to the brokers for giving up an hour of your time when we know it's a busy time. So thank you everybody for for joining us today, and see you again soon.